When my daughter-in-law Jessica told me I was too fragile to handle my own housework, I smiled sweetly and handed her the vacuum. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years as a librarian learning how to research everything, including how to systematically dismantle someone's financial life, one credit inquiry at a time. Sometimes the most fragile-looking flowers have the deepest roots. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone has always called me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in Cheyenne, Wyoming my entire life. This isn't one of those stories about a big city or fancy neighborhoods. This is about a small ranch-style house on Elm Street where the wind never stops blowing and your neighbors wave from their pickup trucks. I spent 32 years working at the Laramie County Library, starting as a part-time clerk when my son David was in elementary school, and working my way up to head librarian before I retired 5 years ago. People always saw me as the quiet type, the woman who organized book sales and remembered everyone's favorite authors. What they didn't realize was that spending 3 decades helping people find information had taught me how to find anything about anyone. I lost my husband Tom 4 years ago to a heart attack that came without warning. One morning he was fixing the fence gate that had been sticking all summer, and by evening he was gone. The grief nearly broke me, but David stepped in immediately. He insisted I shouldn't be alone, that the house was too much for me to manage, that I needed help with everything from groceries to doctor appointments. At first, I thought it was sweet how much he cared. He'd always been a good son, the kind who called every Sunday and remembered my birthday without his wife having to remind him. When he married Jessica 3 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. She was pretty in that polished way that young women achieve with the right makeup and clothes, and she seemed devoted to David and their twin boys, Lucas and Mason, who were 8 years old and full of the kind of energy that made my house feel alive again. The changes started small. Jessica would visit and notice that I hadn't dusted the ceiling fans or that there were water spots on the bathroom mirror. She'd make little comments about how hard it must be for me to keep up with everything at my age. She'd offer to help, which I appreciated at first, but her help came with suggestions. Maybe I should consider a cleaning service. Maybe I should think about simplifying my belongings. Maybe I should acknowledge that some tasks were becoming too much for me. The word fragile started appearing in her vocabulary like a gentle poison. I was too fragile to move the heavy laundry basket. Too fragile to climb the stepladder to change light bulbs. Too fragile to lift bags of groceries or rearrange furniture or do any of the 100 small tasks that had been part of my daily routine for decades. David seemed to absorb her concerns like a sponge. Suddenly, he was treating me like I was made of glass. He'd rush to help me with things I'd been doing perfectly well on my own. He'd exchange glances with Jessica when I mentioned tasks I'd completed around the house, as if they were sharing some secret knowledge about my declining capabilities. When I protested that I was perfectly capable of managing my own home, Jessica would pat my hand and say things like, "Of course you are, Maggie, but there's no shame in accepting that we all slow down eventually." The way she said it made me feel like I was being unreasonable for insisting on my own competence. The financial discussions began about 6 months ago. Jessica started mentioning how expensive it was to maintain an older home, how the property taxes in our neighborhood were climbing, how much money I could save by downsizing to something more manageable. She spoke about assisted living communities like they were vacation resorts, full of activities and people my own age who would understand my limitations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She researched places with names like Golden Sunset Manor and Peaceful Meadows, printing out brochures and leaving them on my kitchen counter where I couldn't miss them. David would nod along when she talked about these options, adding practical concerns about my safety living alone and the financial burden of maintaining a house that was really too big for one person. What bothered me most wasn't the suggestions themselves, but the way they talked about my life as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a life being lived. They spoke about my house, my routines, my independence as if they were obstacles to overcome rather than choices I had made. Jessica had a way of framing every conversation as if she were looking out for my best interests. but her concern felt performative, like she was playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law for an audience that included David and, occasionally, the neighbors who happened to overhear. I started paying closer attention to the dynamics when they visited. Jessica would walk through my house like she was conducting an inspection, running her finger along surfaces to check for dust, opening cabinets to see how organized they were, commenting on burned-out light bulbs or scuff marks on the walls. She'd mention these observations to David in my presence, as if I weren't standing right there. "David, did you notice that your mom's kitchen faucet is dripping again? She really shouldn't be dealing with plumbing issues at her age." Or, "I think the carpet in the living room is starting to show its age. It might be a safety hazard with those loose edges." Every comment was wrapped in concern, but underneath was the implication that I was no longer capable of maintaining my own environment. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and I was looking forward to my favorite season. I had spent the morning cleaning my house from top to bottom because David and his family were coming for dinner. I vacuumed, dusted, scrubbed the bathroom, and even washed the windows to let in more of the autumn light. I was proud of how everything looked and excited to show them that I was managing just fine on my own. When they arrived, Jessica walked through the house with her usual critical eye, but this time she didn't just make comments to David. She turned to me directly and said, "Maggie, I can see you've been trying to keep up with the housework, but honestly, you look exhausted. I think it's time we face the reality that you're just too fragile for this kind of physical work anymore." The word fragile hit me like a slap. I had spent the entire morning proving to myself and to them that I was anything but fragile, and she had dismissed all of my effort with that single word. But what happened next was worse. David immediately agreed with her. He didn't ask how I felt about the housework or whether I had struggled with any particular task. He simply nodded and said, "Mom, Jessica's right. We've been worried about you overexerting yourself. Maybe it's time to seriously consider getting some help. Or better yet, finding a place where you don't have to worry about any of this." I stood in my own living room, surrounded by the results of my morning's work, and listened to my son and his wife discuss my limitations as if I were a child who had been caught doing something dangerous. Jessica suggested that they could research cleaning services for me, or better yet, start looking more seriously at senior communities where housekeeping was included in the monthly fee. She spoke about my future as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if my opinion were irrelevant to the decision-making process. The conversation continued over dinner, with Jessica outlining practical steps they could take to help me transition to a more appropriate living situation. That night, after they left, I sat in my clean house and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. It was a cold, clear understanding that Jessica saw me as an obstacle to something she wanted, and that David had been convinced to see me the same way. I realized that my independence, my home, my choices, were all being systematically undermined by someone who had positioned herself as my advocate while working to strip away everything that made my life my own. Jessica's concern wasn't about my well-being. It was about control, about moving pieces on a board where I was no longer a player but simply a piece to be relocated. I had always been a researcher by nature and by profession. When library patrons came to me with questions, I didn't just find them the obvious answers. I dug deeper, found connections, uncovered information they didn't even know they needed. That night, I decided to apply those same skills to understanding exactly who Jessica really was and what she was really after. I had been passive for too long, accepting her version of my capabilities and limitations. It was time to do what I did best: research, investigate, and uncover the truth. But this time, the truth I was seeking wasn't in books or databases. It was in credit reports, financial records, and the digital footprints that people leave when they think no one is paying attention. I started with what I could observe directly. Jessica always carried expensive handbags and wore designer clothes that seemed beyond what David's salary as a middle school teacher could support. She drove a new SUV that she'd mentioned was leased, not purchased, and she frequently talked about home improvement projects they were planning for their house across town. She had strong opinions about brands, about restaurants, about vacation destinations that suggested someone who was accustomed to spending money freely. When she talked about my financial situation, she demonstrated a surprising familiarity with property values in my neighborhood, with the potential costs of assisted living, with investment strategies for seniors. Her knowledge seemed too detailed, too specific for someone who was simply concerned about her mother-in-law's welfare. I began paying attention to conversations differently. When Jessica mentioned that she'd been researching senior communities, I asked which websites she'd been using. When she talked about property values, I asked where she'd gotten her information. When she discussed the financial advantages of downsizing, I pressed for specifics about the numbers she was using. What I discovered was that Jessica had been conducting her own research, but not into my best interests. She had been researching my assets, my neighborhood's real estate trends, the potential value of my property if it were sold. She knew more about my financial situation than I had shared with her, which meant she had been investigating me without my knowledge or consent. The realization that I was being studied, evaluated, and planned around without my participation was both infuriating and clarifying. Jessica hadn't just decided I was too fragile for housework. She had decided I was too fragile for independence, too fragile for decision-making, too fragile to maintain control over my own life and assets. Her campaign to convince David that I needed help wasn't about helping me. It was about positioning herself and David as the responsible parties, who would inevitably need to take control of my affairs. The more fragile she could make me appear, the more necessary their intervention would become. I realized that I had been approaching this situation all wrong. I had been defending my capabilities, trying to prove that I was still competent and independent. But Jessica wasn't really concerned about my housekeeping abilities. She was concerned about my continued autonomy, my continued control over my own resources. The housework was just the most visible, most easily criticized aspect of my independent living. If she could convince David that I couldn't handle basic domestic tasks, it would be much easier to convince him that I couldn't handle more complex responsibilities, like financial management, healthcare decisions, or property ownership. That understanding changed everything. I stopped trying to prove that I could clean my house perfectly and started thinking about what Jessica really wanted and how I could use her assumptions against her. If she wanted to see me as fragile, I could use that perception to hide my real activities. If she wanted to believe that I was incapable of managing complex tasks, I could let her believe that while I managed the most complex task of all, systematically dismantling her carefully constructed plans. I had spent my career helping people find information, but I had also spent years learning how information could be used, how research could become power, how knowledge could be weaponized by someone who knew how to use it strategically. The next phase of my plan required patience and careful observation. I needed to understand exactly what Jessica's financial situation really was, what vulnerabilities she might have, what pressure points I could use to disrupt her sense of control. I needed to understand how she had gained access to information about my finances and whether she had overstepped any legal boundaries in her research. Most importantly, I needed to document everything I discovered so that when the time came to act, I would have the evidence and the strategy necessary to protect myself and reclaim control over my own life. Jessica had made the mistake of assuming that being fragile meant being helpless. She was about to learn the difference. The morning after Jessica called me too fragile for housework, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the library where I used to work and asked my former colleague Patricia if I could use one of the public computers. She looked surprised to see me there so early, but she didn't ask questions when I explained I needed to do some research. Patricia had always respected my privacy, and after 32 years of working together, she trusted that whatever I was investigating was important. What she didn't know was that I was about to use every research skill I'd developed over 3 decades to uncover the truth about the woman who had married my son. I started with the basics: social media profiles, public records, anything that Jessica had made publicly available about herself and her life with David. What I found immediately caught my attention. Jessica's Facebook and Instagram accounts painted a picture of someone living well beyond what a teacher's salary could support. Photos from expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Denver and Colorado Springs, shopping excursions that featured designer bags and jewelry. The posts were carefully curated to show a lifestyle of comfort and leisure, but they also revealed a pattern of spending that seemed inconsistent with their supposed income level. I dug deeper into public records, starting with property records for the house David and Jessica owned. They had purchased it 2 years ago, shortly before their wedding, with a mortgage that was significantly larger than what David's teaching salary alone could qualify for. The mortgage application, which I was able to access through the county records office, showed Jessica's income listed as coming from, quote, freelance marketing consultation, but the amount seemed inflated for someone who, as far as I knew, worked sporadically from home. The down payment had been substantial, much more than a young couple should have been able to save, especially given David's student loan debt from his teaching degree. I spent hours cross-referencing information, following digital breadcrumbs that led from one discovery to another. Jessica's employment history was spotty and inconsistent. She had worked for several marketing firms over the past 5 years, but none of the positions had lasted more than 18 months. Her LinkedIn profile claimed expertise in, quote, financial planning and investment strategies for seniors, which struck me as oddly specific given that she had never mentioned this particular area of focus to our family. The more I researched, the more I realized that Jessica had been presenting different versions of herself to different audiences. The breakthrough came when I found Jessica's business registration with the state of Wyoming. She had registered a limited liability company called Senior Life Transitions Consulting just 6 months ago, around the same time she had started making suggestions about my need for assisted living. The business description was vague, mentioning, quote, advisory services for aging adults and their families, but it was registered at the same address as David and Jessica's home. According to the filing, she was the sole owner and operator of this business, but she had never mentioned it to David or to me. This wasn't just a side project she had forgotten to mention. This was a deliberate business venture that she had kept secret from her own family. I called the Wyoming Secretary of State's office and requested more detailed information about Jessica's business registration. The clerk was helpful and explained that I could access additional documentation for a small fee. What I discovered in those documents made my blood run cold. Jessica's business plan, which was required as part of her LLC application, specifically outlined strategies for, quote, identifying and assisting elderly individuals who may benefit from transitional living arrangements. The plan included methods for evaluating home safety and maintenance capabilities and, quote, providing family education about senior care options. She had literally created a business around convincing elderly people that they needed to give up their independence. But the most disturbing part of the business plan was the section on, quote, compensation structures. Jessica's consulting business operated on a commission basis with senior living facilities in the region. She received referral fees for every client she successfully placed in one of her partner facilities. The amounts were substantial, ranging from $2,000 to $5,000 per placement, depending on the level of care and the monthly fees of the facility. Jessica wasn't just trying to convince me to move to assisted living because she thought it was best for me. She was trying to convince me to move because she would receive a significant financial payment for making it happen. I felt sick as the full scope of her deception became clear. Jessica had been treating me like a business opportunity from the moment she married my son. Every conversation about my limitations, every suggestion about assisted living, every comment about my fragility had been part of a calculated effort to create a client for her secret business. She had been studying me, documenting my supposed decline, building a case for why I needed her services, all while positioning herself as a caring family member who only wanted what was best for me. I needed to understand how far this went and whether David was aware of any of it. I started investigating their joint finances, which proved more challenging but not impossible. Credit reports are surprisingly accessible if you know how to request them properly, and as someone who had helped library patrons navigate complex information systems for decades, I had learned to be resourceful about finding information that wasn't immediately obvious. Through a combination of public records, cross-referenced addresses, and careful database searches, I was able to piece together a picture of David and Jessica's financial situation that was far more complex than I had imagined. They were deeply in debt, credit card balances that totaled more than $40,000, a car loan that was underwater, and a mortgage that consumed nearly 60% of David's take-home pay. Jessica's sporadic income from her legitimate consulting work wasn't nearly enough to cover their lifestyle, which explained why she had branched out into senior placement services. But even that income wasn't enough to keep up with their spending. They had been living on credit for months, making minimum payments and accumulating interest charges that were pushing them deeper into financial trouble. The most shocking discovery came when I found evidence of identity monitoring services on their accounts. Jessica had been using these services to track changes in my credit report and financial accounts. She knew when I made large purchases, when I paid bills, when I had any kind of financial activity. She had been monitoring my financial life without my knowledge or consent, gathering information that would help her make the case that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The identity monitoring wasn't for my protection, it was for her intelligence gathering. I realized that Jessica's timeline for getting me into assisted living was probably driven by their financial desperation. The referral fees from placing me in a facility would provide immediate relief for their debt situation, and if they could somehow gain control over my assets, it would solve their long-term financial problems entirely. This wasn't just about one referral fee. This was about positioning themselves to take control of my house, my savings, my entire financial life under the guise of helping me manage what I supposedly couldn't handle myself. The evidence kept mounting as I dug deeper. I found emails between Jessica and several assisted living facilities in the area, emails that discussed my case specifically. She had been shopping around for the best commission rate, describing me as a high-value placement opportunity because of my property ownership and financial stability. She had provided these facilities with detailed information about my house, my estimated net worth, and her assessment of my declining capabilities. She had been marketing me to these places like I was a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. What made this even more disturbing was the realization that Jessica had been documenting everything I did or said that could be used as evidence of my declining competence. She had been taking photos of my house during visits, focusing on any signs of wear or minor maintenance issues. She had been keeping notes about our conversations, particularly any moments when I seemed tired or confused or unable to remember something perfectly. She had been building a case file on me, collecting evidence that could be used to support a claim that I was no longer capable of independent living. I found records of her communications with an elder law attorney in Cheyenne, someone who specialized in cases involving elderly individuals who needed assistance managing their affairs. Jessica had consulted with this attorney about the process for obtaining guardianship or conservatorship over an elderly relative who was no longer competent to make their own decisions. She had asked specific questions about what kind of evidence would be needed to prove incompetence, and what steps would be necessary to gain legal control over someone's financial assets. The attorney's responses, which I was able to access through a combination of public records requests and careful cross-referencing, outlined a clear roadmap for taking control of an elderly person's life. The process involved documenting declining mental or physical capabilities, obtaining medical evaluations that supported claims of incompetence, and presenting evidence to a court that the elderly person was no longer able to make safe and reasonable decisions about their own welfare. Jessica had been following this roadmap step by step, gathering the documentation she would need to make her case. I spent days absorbing the full scope of what Jessica had been planning. This wasn't just financial elder abuse. This was a systematic campaign to strip me of my autonomy, my property, and my right to make decisions about my own life. She had been treating me like a mark in a long-term con game, someone to be manipulated and eventually controlled for financial gain. Every kind gesture, every expression of concern, every offer to help had been part of a calculated strategy to position herself as my caretaker and eventual controller. But Jessica had made one crucial mistake in all of her planning and documentation. She had assumed that I was exactly what I appeared to be: a quiet, elderly librarian who wouldn't know how to fight back against someone younger, more tech-savvy, and more aggressive. She had seen my politeness as weakness, my kindness as gullibility, my age as automatic incompetence. She had never considered that someone who had spent 32 years helping people navigate complex information systems might be capable of conducting her own investigation. Now I had everything I needed to understand not just what Jessica was planning, but how to stop her. I had documentation of her secret business, evidence of her financial monitoring of my accounts, records of her communications with elder law attorneys, and assisted living facilities. I had proof that she had been operating a business designed to profit from elderly people's vulnerability, while presenting herself as a caring family member. Most importantly, I had identified the pressure points in her own life that I could use to turn her strategy against her. Jessica's biggest vulnerability was her financial desperation. She and David were living beyond their means, accumulating debt faster than they could pay it off, and relying on Jessica's placement fees to keep them afloat. Their credit was already strained, their debt-to-income ratio was unsustainable, and they were one missed payment away from serious financial consequences. Jessica had been so focused on gaining access to my assets that she had left herself completely exposed to financial manipulation. The second vulnerability was the legal and ethical problems with her business practices. Jessica had been using her position as a family member to gather information about me that she was then using for business purposes. She had been monitoring my financial accounts without authorization, consulting with attorneys about gaining control over my assets, and marketing me to facilities as a placement opportunity. These activities crossed multiple legal and ethical lines, and if exposed properly, they would destroy not just her business but potentially lead to criminal charges. I realized that I didn't need to fight Jessica on her terms. I didn't need to prove that I was capable of living independently or managing my own affairs. Instead, I needed to demonstrate that she was the one who couldn't be trusted, that her concerns about my welfare were actually part of a business strategy designed to profit from my vulnerability. I needed to turn her own tactics against her and show David exactly who he had married and what she had been planning to do to his mother. The investigation phase was complete. I had gathered all the evidence I needed to understand the full scope of Jessica's deception and to identify the specific ways I could disrupt her plans. Now it was time to move from gathering information to taking action. Jessica had been patient and methodical in her approach to undermining my independence. I was going to be equally patient and methodical in dismantling her financial life and exposing her true intentions. The difference was that I actually knew what I was doing, while she had been operating under assumptions that were about to prove very expensive. I spent my last day at the library, printing and organizing all of my findings. I created files for different categories of evidence: financial records, business documentation, communications with third parties, and legal consultations. I made copies of everything and stored them in multiple locations. I wasn't just building a defense against Jessica's plans. I was building an offense that would destroy her ability to carry them out and ensure that she never had the opportunity to target another elderly person the way she had been targeting me. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence. Not the forced confidence of someone trying to prove their capabilities to skeptical family members, but the genuine confidence of someone who understands exactly what they're dealing with and has the tools necessary to handle it effectively. Jessica had seen me as an easy target, someone whose age and gentleness made her vulnerable to manipulation. She was about to learn that underestimating a librarian's research skills was a very costly mistake. The first step in my counterattack was establishing a relationship with someone Jessica would never suspect as an ally. Robert Chen had been my financial advisor for 15 years, ever since Tom and I decided to get serious about retirement planning. He was a methodical man in his 50s who wore perfectly pressed shirts and spoke in measured tones that inspired confidence. More importantly, he understood the complexities of financial privacy laws and had access to systems that could help me monitor and control access to my accounts in ways that Jessica would never see coming. I called Robert on a Wednesday morning and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at his office in downtown Cheyenne, I brought with me a folder containing copies of all the evidence I had gathered about Jessica's secret business and her unauthorized monitoring of my financial activity. Robert's expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the documents, particularly the evidence that Jessica had been using identity monitoring services to track my credit activity without my knowledge or consent. "Margaret," he said after carefully reviewing everything, "what Jessica has been doing constitutes identity theft and financial fraud. She's been accessing your personal financial information without authorization and using it for business purposes. This isn't just unethical, it's illegal." He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, a gesture I recognized as his thinking pose. "The question is what you want to do about it. We could report this to law enforcement immediately." Or we could take a more strategic approach that gives you maximum control over the outcome. I had already decided on the strategic approach. I didn't want Jessica arrested immediately, because that would create a crisis that might generate sympathy for her and David. Instead, I wanted to systematically dismantle her ability to harm me or anyone else, while demonstrating to David exactly who he had married. I wanted Jessica to experience the same sense of powerlessness and violation that she had been inflicting on me, but I wanted to do it in a way that appeared to be the natural consequence of her own poor decisions rather than deliberate sabotage. Robert and I spent 2 hours developing what we called a financial containment strategy. The first element was changing all of my account numbers and establishing new security protocols that would prevent anyone from monitoring my financial activity without my explicit written consent. Robert arranged for new accounts at a different bank, one that Jessica had no previous relationship with and wouldn't think to monitor. We transferred all of my assets to these new accounts and established alerts that would notify me immediately if anyone attempted to access information about my finances. The second element was creating a false financial trail that would mislead Jessica about my actual resources and plans. We left small amounts in my old accounts and arranged for regular automated transactions that would make it appear that I was spending money on assisted living research, home healthcare consultations, and other services that Jessica would interpret as evidence that I was preparing to give up my independence. These transactions were actually payments to legitimate businesses that provided consultation services, but Jessica would see them on any monitoring reports as confirmation that her pressure campaign was working. The third element was the most complex and the most satisfying. Robert helped me establish what he called financial countermeasures that would systematically disrupt Jessica's credit and her ability to continue her predatory business practices. We identified every financial institution that Jessica and David used, every credit card account, every loan. Then we began the process of triggering legitimate financial scrutiny that would make their lives extremely difficult without technically doing anything illegal or unethical. The credit reporting system has built-in mechanisms for detecting and investigating potential fraud. If multiple people request credit reports for the same individual within a short period, it triggers automatic fraud alerts. If someone's financial activity suddenly changes in ways that suggest identity theft, the system flags the accounts for review. If a business is reported for unethical practices, credit agencies investigate not just the business but the personal finances of the business owner. Robert and I were going to use these legitimate protective systems to turn Jessica's own tactics against her. We started by filing fraud alerts on my own accounts, officially documenting that I had been the victim of unauthorized financial monitoring. This created a legal paper trail that would protect me and make it much more difficult for Jessica to access information about my finances in the future. But it also triggered automatic investigations into who had been accessing my information and how they had obtained it. The identity monitoring service that Jessica had been using would be required to provide documentation about who had requested the monitoring and what authorization they had provided. Next, we began the process of reporting Jessica's business practices to every relevant regulatory agency. Her secret senior placement business violated multiple consumer protection laws because she had been operating without proper licensing and had been using deceptive practices to gather clients. Robert helped me file complaints with the Wyoming Department of Insurance, which regulates businesses that provide advice about senior care, and with the Better Business Bureau, which tracks complaints about businesses that prey on elderly consumers. Each complaint triggered automatic investigations that would examine not just Jessica's business practices, but her personal financial situation. Regulatory agencies routinely scrutinize the finances of business owners who are accused of unethical practices, and Jessica's debt levels and income irregularities would not survive careful examination. More importantly, these investigations would generate inquiries to her creditors, her bank, and her mortgage company, all of which would appear on her credit report and potentially trigger fraud alerts on her accounts. The beauty of this approach was that everything we were doing was completely legitimate and actually served important consumer protection purposes. We weren't fabricating complaints or false information. We were using the system exactly as it was designed to be used, to investigate and stop predatory practices targeting vulnerable elderly people. Jessica had been operating in the shadows. counting on the fact that her victims wouldn't know how to fight back or wouldn't have the resources to do so effectively. She had never considered that one of her targets might be someone with the knowledge and connections necessary to turn the system against her. While Robert handled the financial and regulatory aspects of our strategy, I focused on the personal and family dynamics. I needed to document Jessica's behavior in a way that would be convincing to David when the time came to reveal what I had discovered. I also needed to protect myself from any escalation of Jessica's pressure campaign while she was still unaware that I was fighting back. I began carrying a small digital recorder whenever Jessica was likely to be around. It was a device I had purchased years earlier for recording oral history interviews at the library, and it was small enough to keep in my pocket without being noticed. I wanted to capture Jessica's actual words when she talked about my limitations and her suggestions for my future living arrangements. I particularly wanted to record any conversations where she discussed financial matters or made statements about my competence to manage my own affairs. The recordings I captured over the next few weeks were even more damaging than I had expected. Jessica spoke about me with a casual cruelty that was shocking to hear. When she thought I was out of earshot, she would tell David things like, "Your mother is getting worse every time I see her. She can't even keep track of simple conversations anymore." She would exaggerate minor incidents, turning normal forgetfulness into evidence of cognitive decline. When I misplaced my reading glasses or forgot someone's name, Jessica would present these ordinary occurrences as symptoms of serious mental deterioration. More significantly, I recorded several conversations where Jessica discussed her timeline for getting me into assisted living and her frustration with my resistance to her suggestions. She spoke about me like I was an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a person with legitimate preferences about my own life. She talked about strategies for wearing down my resistance and ways to, quote, help David see that his mother needs more help than she's willing to admit. These recordings would be crucial evidence when the time came to show David exactly how his wife had been manipulating both of us. I also began documenting Jessica's behavior more systematically, keeping a detailed log of her visits, her comments, and her suggestions. I noted every time she criticized my housekeeping, every suggestion she made about my limitations, every attempt to involve David in discussions about my need for assistance. The pattern that emerged was clear and deliberate. Jessica wasn't responding to any actual decline in my capabilities. She was creating a narrative of decline that served her business purposes. During this period, I maintained the appearance of someone who was gradually accepting Jessica's suggestions. I let her believe that her pressure campaign was working. I asked occasional questions about assisted living facilities, mentioned concerns about maintaining my house, and thanked her for her helpful suggestions about my future. This performance served multiple purposes. It kept Jessica from escalating her pressure tactics, it provided opportunities for me to gather more evidence about her plans, and it lulled her into believing that she was successfully manipulating me. Meanwhile, the financial disruption we had initiated was beginning to take effect. Robert received regular updates from the various agencies that were investigating Jessica's business practices. The Wyoming Department of Insurance had opened a formal investigation into her unlicensed senior placement activities. The Better Business Bureau had contacted several of the assisted living facilities that Jessica had been working with, and at least 2 of them had suspended their relationships with her pending the outcome of the investigation. More importantly, the fraud alerts and regulatory inquiries had triggered automatic reviews of Jessica and David's credit accounts. Their mortgage company had received multiple inquiries about their financial stability, which prompted a routine review of their loan status. Their credit card companies had been notified about potential fraud concerns, which led to temporary holds on several of their accounts, while the companies verified that the accounts hadn't been compromised. Jessica began showing signs of stress that she couldn't fully hide. She seemed distracted during visits, frequently checking her phone and taking calls that she would step outside to handle. She mentioned to David that they were having some temporary issues with their credit cards, framing it as a minor inconvenience caused by increased security measures at their bank. She didn't mention the business investigation or the fact that her income from senior placements had suddenly dried up because facilities were no longer willing to work with her. I could see that David was beginning to notice Jessica's stress, but he interpreted it as concern for his mother rather than anxiety about her own situation. When Jessica suggested more urgently that we needed to make decisions about my living situation, David supported her because he thought she was worried about my welfare. He didn't realize that Jessica's urgency was driven by her desperate need for the placement fee that would come from getting me into assisted living, money that she needed to help cover their mounting financial obligations. The most delicate part of my strategy was timing the revelation of Jessica's deception. I needed to wait until the financial pressure on Jessica had reached a critical point, but I also needed to act before she became desperate enough to take more aggressive steps to gain control over my affairs. I was monitoring her situation through Robert, who received regular updates about the various investigations and their impact on Jessica's credit and business activities. The turning point came when Robert informed me that Jessica and David's mortgage company had initiated a formal review of their loan based on concerns about their debt-to-income ratio and some irregularities in Jessica's reported income. The mortgage review would require them to provide detailed documentation about their finances, including tax returns, bank statements, and verification of all income sources. Jessica's secret business income would be exposed, and the fact that it had recently disappeared would raise serious questions about their ability to continue making their mortgage payments. At the same time, Jessica's credit card companies had reduced her credit limits and increased her interest rates based on the fraud concerns and the negative information from the business investigation. The financial pressure she was experiencing was becoming unsustainable, and I could see her growing desperation in the way she talked about my need to make immediate decisions about my living situation. I realized that Jessica was approaching a point where she might abandon her careful manipulation strategy and attempt something more direct. She had been consulting with an elder law attorney about guardianship procedures, and I was concerned that financial desperation might push her to accelerate that timeline. I needed to reveal what I had discovered before she had the opportunity to take legal action based on the false case file she had been building about my incompetence. I spent several days preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I needed to tell David that his wife had been systematically deceiving both of us, that she had been operating a secret business designed to profit from elderly people's vulnerability, and that she had been treating me like a target rather than a family member. I needed to present this information in a way that would be convincing but not devastating, firm but not cruel. I decided to approach David during one of his solo visits, when Jessica was busy with the twins and couldn't accompany him. I asked him to sit down because I had something important to discuss with him, something that would be difficult for both of us, but that he needed to know. I could see the concern in his eyes as he settled into the chair across from me, probably expecting that I was going to announce some health crisis or express concerns about my ability to continue living independently. Instead, I handed him a folder containing copies of all the evidence I had gathered about Jessica's secret business, her financial monitoring of my accounts, her communications with attorneys and assisted living facilities, and the recordings of her conversations about me. I watched his face change as he worked through the documents, seeing his confusion give way to shock and then to something approaching horror as he realized the scope of what Jessica had been planning. "David," I said gently, "I need you to understand that I'm not showing you this to hurt you or to damage your marriage. I'm showing you this because Jessica has been using both of us, and I couldn't let her continue without you knowing what was really happening." I paused, letting him absorb the information before continuing. "She hasn't been trying to help me. She's been trying to profit from me. And if she's willing to do this to your mother, you need to think carefully about what else she might be willing to do." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. David struggled to reconcile the woman he had married with the evidence of her deception and manipulation. He asked questions about how I had gathered the information, whether I was certain about what the documents proved, whether there might be some innocent explanation for Jessica's behavior. I answered each question as patiently and thoroughly as I could, but I could see that he was already beginning to understand that there was no innocent explanation for a secret business designed to profit from elderly people's vulnerability. By the time David left that evening, he was quiet and thoughtful in a way that told me he was beginning to process the reality of what Jessica had been doing. He asked me not to confront Jessica directly until he had time to think about how to handle the situation. I agreed, knowing that the financial pressure we had already initiated would continue to work against Jessica regardless of what David decided to do about their marriage. The final phase of my strategy was already in motion, and Jessica's ability to harm me or anyone else was being systematically dismantled through legitimate channels that she couldn't fight or escape. All that remained was to ensure that David understood the full scope of what had been happening, and that Jessica faced appropriate consequences for her actions. The quiet librarian she had tried to manipulate and control was about to demonstrate that knowledge, patience, and careful planning could be far more powerful than aggression and deception. The phone call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper when David's voice cut through the quiet morning air with an urgency I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, calling to confess some misdeed. "Mom, we need to talk. Jessica's gone completely off the rails, and I think you were right about everything." His voice was strained, exhausted, like someone who had been awake all night wrestling with uncomfortable truths. I invited him over immediately, and within 20 minutes, he was sitting across from me at the same table where I had revealed Jessica's deception just a week earlier. This time, however, David looked like a man who had aged years in a matter of days. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone whose world had been turned upside down. He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages and voicemails that Jessica had left him throughout the night. The messages revealed a woman in complete panic. Jessica had discovered that their mortgage company was demanding immediate documentation of all their income sources and threatening foreclosure proceedings if they couldn't verify their ability to make payments. She had found out that her business accounts had been frozen pending investigation by the state insurance commissioner. Most devastatingly, she had learned that several of the assisted living facilities she had been working with had not only terminated their relationships with her, but were considering filing their own complaints about her business practices. "She's been calling and texting me all night," David said, scrolling through message after message. At first, she was just angry about the mortgage review, saying the bank was being unreasonable and asking too many questions. But then she started getting these calls from the insurance department and the Better Business Bureau, and she completely lost it. She's accusing everyone of conspiring against her, saying someone must have reported her business unfairly. I listened as David read some of Jessica's messages aloud. In them, she ranted about regulatory agencies that didn't understand her business model, complained about assisted living facilities that were overreacting to minor procedural issues, and expressed outrage that anyone would question her motives for helping elderly people transition to appropriate care. What was most revealing about the messages was Jessica's complete inability to acknowledge that she had done anything wrong. Even facing multiple investigations and the collapse of her secret business, she maintained that she was the victim of unfair treatment. The breaking point had come when Jessica discovered that their primary credit card had been canceled due to what the company called concerns about account security and potential fraudulent activity. David had tried to call the credit card company to resolve what he assumed was a misunderstanding, only to be told that the cancellation was based on information from their fraud prevention department and would not be reversed. When Jessica learned about this, she had accused David of sabotaging their finances, demanded to know if he had contacted their creditors, and threatened to leave him if he didn't support her against what she called false accusations. "Mom, I spent all night going through our finances, really looking at them for the first time in months," David continued. "Jessica had been handling most of our money management, and I trusted her to take care of it. But now I can see that we're in much worse shape than I realized. We've been living on credit for almost a year, and Jessica's been making minimum payments on everything while spending money we didn't have." David showed me bank statements and credit card bills that painted a picture of financial recklessness that went far beyond what I had discovered in my research. Jessica had been using cash advances from one credit card to make payments on others, a practice that had accumulated thousands of dollars in fees and interest charges. She had been shopping compulsively, spending money on clothes, electronics, and home improvement projects that they couldn't afford. Most disturbingly, she had been withdrawing cash regularly from their accounts without documenting what the money was being used for. "The worst part is that she's been lying to me about how much money we had," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "She would show me bank statements, but apparently she was only showing me one account while hiding others. We have credit card debt I didn't even know existed. We're behind on our property taxes. And now, with her business income gone and these investigations affecting our credit, I don't know how we're going to make our mortgage payment next month." I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy as I listened to David describe the financial chaos that Jessica's deception had created. The systematic pressure that Robert and I had applied was working exactly as we had planned. But seeing my son's distress reminded me that Jessica's victims included David and the twins, not just elderly people she had targeted through her business. I had wanted Jessica to face consequences for her actions, but I hadn't fully considered how those consequences would affect the people I cared about. David pulled out a folder that contained printed copies of emails and documents he had found on Jessica's computer. "I went through her files last night while she was out," he said. "Mom, what she was planning to do to you was even worse than what you showed me. She had detailed financial projections about how much money she could make if she got guardianship over you. She had researched the legal process for having you declared incompetent. She even had a timeline for selling your house and moving your assets into accounts that she would control." The documents David showed me revealed the full scope of Jessica's long-term plan. She had been treating my situation like a business case study, calculating potential returns on investment, and developing strategies for maximizing her financial benefit. She had estimated that she could generate over $200,000 through a combination of placement fees, asset management commissions, and eventual inheritance if she could gain control over my finances. She had viewed our family relationship as nothing more than an opportunity for financial exploitation. One particularly chilling document was a detailed assessment of my personality and behavior patterns that Jessica had been compiling for months. She had been studying me like a psychology experiment, noting my daily routines, my social interactions, my decision-making patterns, and any signs of physical or mental decline. She had been building a profile that she could use to convince a court that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Every conversation we had shared, every visit to my house, every family gathering, had been an opportunity for Jessica to gather intelligence that she could use against me. "There's more," David said grimly. "She wasn't just targeting you. She had files on other elderly people in the community, people she had met through the twins' school or at community events. She was building a client base of potential targets, documenting information about their living situations, their family relationships, their financial status. This wasn't just about making money off one person. She was trying to build a business around systematically exploiting elderly people." The revelation that Jessica had been targeting other elderly people in our community transformed my understanding of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just personal family drama or even individual financial abuse. Jessica had been operating what amounted to a predatory business designed to identify and exploit vulnerable elderly people throughout Cheyenne. She had been using her position as a community member and mother to gain access to information about potential targets, building relationships that she could later exploit for financial gain. David showed me lists of names and addresses that Jessica had compiled, along with notes about each person's living situation, family relationships, and apparent financial resources. Some of the names I recognized as neighbors or acquaintances from church and community events. Jessica had been systematically gathering information about elderly people who lived alone, who had adult children living out of state, who might be vulnerable to suggestions about needing assistance with daily living. She had been treating our entire community like a hunting ground for potential victims. "I feel sick about all of this," David said, rubbing his face with his hands. "I married someone who was planning to abuse my own mother and other people in our community for money. I brought her into our family, and I defended her when you tried to maintain your independence. I actually thought you were being stubborn and unreasonable when you resisted her suggestions about assisted living. I was helping her manipulate you without even realizing it." I reached across the table and took David's hand. "You couldn't have known," I said gently. "Jessica is skilled at deception, and she was telling you things that seemed reasonable on the surface. She was using your love for me against both of us, making you think that supporting her meant protecting me. That's how manipulation works. It's designed to be invisible to the people who are being manipulated." David squeezed my hand and took a shaky breath. "What she did to you, what she was planning to do, it's unforgivable. But Mom, I'm also terrified about what this means for Lucas and Mason. They love Jessica, and she's been a good mother to them as far as I can tell. But if she's capable of this kind of deception and manipulation, what does that mean for their future? How do I protect them from someone who lives in their house and shares custody of them? The question of the twins added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Lucas and Mason were innocent victims of Jessica's deception, and whatever consequences she faced would inevitably affect them as well. David was facing the possibility of divorce, custody battles, financial ruin, and the challenge of explaining to 8-year-old boys why their stepmother might not be living with them anymore. Jessica's actions had created a web of consequences that extended far beyond her intended targets. Over the next few hours, David and I worked together to develop a plan for protecting both our family and the broader community from Jessica's predatory behavior. We needed to ensure that she faced appropriate legal consequences for her actions, but we also needed to minimize the collateral damage to David and the twins. Most importantly, we needed to make sure that the other elderly people on Jessica's target list were warned about her intentions and protected from similar exploitation. Our first step was documenting everything we had discovered and presenting it to law enforcement in a comprehensive package that would be difficult to ignore or dismiss. Robert had already filed complaints with regulatory agencies, but the scope of Jessica's activities warranted criminal investigation. We compiled all of the evidence of her unauthorized financial monitoring, her unlicensed business activities, her plans to exploit elderly people, and her fraudulent representations to assisted living facilities and potential clients. David agreed to provide law enforcement with access to Jessica's computer files and any other evidence that might be relevant to their investigation. He was prepared to cooperate fully with any criminal prosecution, even though it would mean testifying against his own wife. He understood that Jessica's actions constituted serious crimes that affected not just our family, but potentially dozens of other elderly people in our community. We also needed to warn the people on Jessica's target list about her intentions. David and I divided up the list of names and addresses that Jessica had compiled, and we began the delicate process of contacting these individuals or their families to warn them about Jessica's business practices. Many of these conversations were difficult because we had to explain that someone they might have trusted was actually targeting them for financial exploitation. The responses we received from these conversations were both heartbreaking and validating. Several elderly people told us that Jessica had approached them about their living situations, expressing concern about their safety and suggesting that they might benefit from assisted living arrangements. Others reported that Jessica had asked detailed questions about their finances, their family relationships, and their plans for the future. In every case, Jessica had presented herself as a caring community member who was simply looking out for their welfare. Most disturbing were the stories from people who had actually been in the process of working with Jessica's consulting business. One elderly woman had paid Jessica a consultation fee for help evaluating assisted living options, not realizing that Jessica was receiving kickbacks from the facilities she recommended. Another man had given Jessica access to his financial information so she could help him understand his options, not knowing that she was using that information to build a case for his incompetence. These conversations confirmed that Jessica's business wasn't just a plan or a potential threat. She had already been actively exploiting elderly people in our community, taking their money under false pretenses and manipulating them into making decisions that served her financial interests rather than their welfare. The regulatory investigations and credit disruptions that Robert and I had initiated had stopped her from completing some of these schemes, but she had already caused real harm to real people. As word spread about Jessica's activities, the community response was swift and decisive. The Better Business Bureau issued a public warning about her business practices. Local news outlets picked up the story and began investigating other complaints about senior placement services that operated on commission-based models. Several assisted living facilities issued statements distancing themselves from Jessica's business and announcing new policies to prevent similar abuses. The legal consequences began mounting quickly. The Wyoming Attorney General's office opened a criminal investigation into Jessica's business practices, focusing on charges of financial fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. The state insurance commissioner filed formal charges related to her unlicensed business activities and fraudulent representations. The IRS began investigating her tax compliance, particularly regarding unreported income from her placement business. But it was the civil consequences that had the most immediate impact on Jessica's life. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of elderly people who had been targeted by her business, seeking damages for fraud and emotional distress. Her personal assets were frozen, pending the outcome of the various investigations and legal proceedings. Her credit was completely destroyed, making it impossible for her to obtain new financing or even maintain her existing accounts. The psychological pressure of facing multiple investigations, lawsuits, and financial ruin began taking a visible toll on Jessica. David reported that she had become increasingly erratic and paranoid, convinced that everyone was conspiring against her and refusing to accept responsibility for her own actions. She alternated between rage at the injustice of her situation and desperate attempts to convince David that she had been misunderstood and that her business had been legitimate. The final confrontation came when Jessica appeared at my house unannounced, demanding that I fix the situation by telling the authorities that I had been confused about her intentions and that she had never done anything wrong. She was disheveled and frantic, clearly desperate to find some way to escape the consequences of her actions. When I refused to provide false testimony on her behalf, she became threatening, telling me that I would regret crossing her and that she would find ways to make my life difficult. I had anticipated this possibility and was prepared for it. I calmly informed Jessica that our conversation was being recorded and that any threats she made would be reported to law enforcement immediately. I also told her that she was no longer welcome in my home and that any future contact would constitute harassment. The woman who had once called me too fragile for housework was now being told by that same woman that she needed to leave my property immediately or face arrest for trespassing. Jessica's final words to me were revealing of her character and her complete inability to accept responsibility for her actions. She accused me of destroying her family, ruining her business, and turning David against her. She claimed that she had only been trying to help me and that I was ungrateful for her concern. Even facing overwhelming evidence of her deception and manipulation, she maintained that she was the victim and that everyone else was wrong about her intentions. After Jessica left, I called David to let him know about the encounter. He told me that he had already filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of the twins based on Jessica's demonstrated pattern of deception and her involvement in criminal activities. He had also obtained a restraining order that prevented Jessica from contacting me or coming to my house. The legal system was finally providing the protection that I needed and ensuring that Jessica could no longer use her family relationships to target vulnerable people. The aftermath of Jessica's exposure and the collapse of her schemes brought a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in months. The constant pressure to accept limitations that I didn't actually have was gone. The subtle undermining of my confidence and independence had stopped. The threat of losing control over my own life and assets had been eliminated. Most importantly, other elderly people in our community were now protected from Jessica's predatory business practices. But the victory came with costs that I hadn't fully anticipated. David was facing divorce, financial ruin, and the challenge of rebuilding his life as a single father. The twins were experiencing the trauma of their family's dissolution and would need support to understand and recover from what had happened. Our community had been shaken by the revelation that someone they had trusted was actually preying on their most vulnerable members. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that Jessica's greatest mistake had been underestimating the power of an informed and determined elderly person. She had seen my age as automatic vulnerability, my politeness as weakness, my trust as gullibility. She had never considered that someone with decades of research experience might be capable of investigating her background, documenting her activities, and building a case against her that would be strong enough to destroy her completely. The woman who had called me too fragile for housework had learned that fragility and strength aren't mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who appear to be the least threatening. Jessica's credit score wasn't the only thing that had been destroyed. Her reputation, her business, her marriage, and her freedom had all been systematically dismantled by the supposedly fragile woman she had tried to exploit. 6 months after Jessica's arrest, I was standing in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard the familiar sound of David's truck pulling into my driveway. But this time, the engine was followed by the excited chatter of 2 8-year-old boys who had spent the night at my house for the first time since everything had happened. Lucas and Mason burst through my front door like small tornadoes, still in their pajamas but already full of energy and questions about what we were going to do that day. "Grandma Maggie, can we make pancakes shaped like animals again?" Lucas asked, climbing onto one of my kitchen chairs. "And can we help you in the garden?" Dad said you're planting new flowers today. Mason nodded enthusiastically, adding that he wanted to learn how to use the watering can properly because he was old enough to be responsible for real garden work now. David followed them inside, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in over a year. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, his shoulders weren't permanently tensed with stress, and when he smiled at his boys, it reached his eyes in a way that it hadn't during the months when Jessica was manipulating our family. He had lost weight during the divorce proceedings, but it was the healthy kind of weight loss that comes from no longer carrying the burden of constant anxiety and deception. "How did they sleep?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot I always kept ready when the boys stayed over. "I heard them talking pretty late, but they seemed excited about having their own sleepover headquarters in your guest room." I assured him that they had been perfect house guests, though they had indeed stayed awake longer than usual planning all the activities they wanted to do during their weekend with me. The custody battle had been swift and decisive once the full scope of Jessica's criminal activities became clear. The court had granted David full custody of the twins, with Jessica receiving only supervised visitation rights that she had yet to exercise. Her parental rights were being evaluated as part of the ongoing criminal proceedings, and it seemed likely that those rights would be terminated entirely once her sentencing was complete. The boys had adapted to their new routine, with the resilience that children often display when they're finally free from an environment of hidden tension and manipulation. David had moved into a smaller apartment that was closer to the boys' school and to my house. The financial devastation caused by Jessica's debt and legal troubles had forced him to declare bankruptcy, but it had also freed him from the crushing weight of obligations that he had never truly understood or agreed to. He was rebuilding his credit slowly and carefully, with help from Robert Chen, who had agreed to provide financial counseling as part of our family's recovery process. "I have some news," David said, settling into the chair across from me while the boys explored my refrigerator for ingredients to add to their pancake adventure. "Jessica's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. The prosecutor called yesterday to let me know that she's likely to receive between 3 and 5 years in prison, plus restitution requirements for the people she defrauded. They want to know if you're planning to attend the hearing." I had been thinking about the sentencing hearing for weeks, weighing whether my presence would serve any purpose beyond satisfying my curiosity about Jessica's final fate. I had already provided my victim impact statement to the court, detailing how Jessica's actions had affected not just my finances but my sense of safety and trust within my own family. The legal system was handling the punishment aspect of Jessica's crimes, and I didn't feel the need to witness her humiliation in person. "I don't think I need to be there," I told David. "Jessica will face the consequences of her choices regardless of whether I'm in the courtroom. I'm more interested in focusing on the positive changes that have come from all of this." And there had been many positive changes, both for our family and for the broader community that Jessica had been targeting. The investigation into Jessica's business practices had revealed a network of similar schemes operating throughout Wyoming and Colorado. Her case had become a catalyst for stronger consumer protection laws regarding senior placement services and stricter licensing requirements for businesses that provided advice to elderly people about living arrangements. Several other predatory operators had been shut down as a result of the increased scrutiny that Jessica's case had generated. More personally satisfying was the community response that had emerged from the exposure of Jessica's activities. A group of elderly residents had formed what they called the Cheyenne Senior Security Network, a mutual support organization that helped elderly people verify the credentials of service providers and avoid potential scams. I had been invited to serve on the advisory board of this organization, using my research skills to help develop educational materials and screening protocols. The network had already prevented several attempted frauds against elderly residents, including one case where a woman very similar to Jessica had been approaching widows at church functions and offering to help them simplify their financial affairs. The rapid identification and reporting of this woman's suspicious behavior had led to her arrest before she could complete any of her schemes. Our community had learned to be vigilant without becoming paranoid, protective without losing trust entirely. I had also established the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Elder Protection, using money from a settlement with the identity monitoring company that had allowed Jessica to track my financial activities without proper authorization. The foundation provided legal assistance and financial counseling to elderly people who had been victims of financial abuse. and it funded research into prevention strategies that could be implemented in other communities. The foundation's first major project was a comprehensive study of how predatory businesses target elderly people and what warning signs family members should watch for. We were working with geriatricians, social workers, and law enforcement agencies to develop a training program that could help adult children recognize when their elderly parents were being manipulated or exploited. The goal was to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of deception and division that Jessica had created in ours. "You know, Mom," David said, watching Lucas and Mason debate whether chocolate chips or blueberries would make better pancake decorations. "I've been thinking a lot about how different things might have been if you hadn't figured out what Jessica was doing. If you had just accepted her version of your limitations and gone along with her plans." He paused, shaking his head at the thought. "She would have destroyed your independence, taken control of your assets, and probably done the same thing to dozens of other people." I had thought about this alternative timeline many times, imagining myself in an assisted living facility while Jessica managed my finances and made decisions about my care. It was a chilling thought, not just because of what I would have lost personally, but because of how many other elderly people would have fallen victim to Jessica's schemes if her business had been allowed to continue growing. My resistance to her manipulation had been about more than just my own autonomy. It had been about protecting an entire community of vulnerable people. "The scary thing is how close she came to succeeding," David continued. "If you hadn't been a librarian with research skills, if you hadn't known how to investigate her background and gather evidence, if you hadn't had connections like Robert who could help you fight back effectively, she might have gotten away with everything." He looked at his sons, who were now arranging kitchen utensils in preparation for their pancake-making project. I hate thinking about what that would have meant for Lucas and Mason, growing up with someone who was capable of that kind of systematic deception. The boys had been remarkably resilient throughout the turmoil of their family's dissolution. They missed Jessica initially, but they had adapted quickly to spending more time with me and seemed to thrive in the calmer environment that emerged after her departure. David had been honest with them about why Jessica was no longer living with them, explaining in age-appropriate terms that she had made bad choices that hurt people and that she needed to face consequences for those choices. "Dad, can Grandma Maggie teach us how to use the computer to look things up like she did when she was working?" Mason asked, abandoning his pancake preparations to climb onto David's lap. "She said she used to help people find information about anything they wanted to know, and that sounds like a superpower." Lucas nodded enthusiastically, adding that he wanted to learn how to research things too, in case anyone ever tried to trick their family again. I smiled at their enthusiasm and promised that I would teach them basic research skills when they were a little older. But I also explained that the most important protection against being deceived was learning to trust their instincts when something didn't feel right, and always asking questions when adults made claims that seemed suspicious or too good to be true. These were lessons that would serve them well beyond protecting them from financial predators. As the morning progressed and we worked together to create an elaborate pancake breakfast, I reflected on how much my life had changed since the day Jessica first called me too fragile for housework. I was still living independently in the same house, still managing my own affairs, still making my own decisions about my future. But I was also more connected to my community, more involved in protecting other elderly people, and more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. The experience with Jessica had been traumatic, but it had also been transformative. It had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to use skills I had developed professionally in ways I had never imagined. It had shown me that age doesn't automatically equal vulnerability, and that sometimes the people who appear most helpless are actually the most dangerous opponents for those who would exploit them. Most importantly, it had demonstrated the power of information and careful planning when used strategically against those who would abuse trust and manipulate vulnerability. Jessica had underestimated me because she saw only what she expected to see, an elderly woman who could be easily controlled and exploited. She had never considered that decades of helping people navigate complex information systems might translate into an ability to navigate complex revenge systems as well. As we sat down to eat our animal-shaped pancakes, Lucas asked me what I was going to do now that the bad lady was gone and couldn't bother our family anymore. It was a good question. and one that I had been pondering for months. I could have simply returned to my quiet retirement, tending my garden and reading books, and enjoying the peaceful life I had built for myself. But the experience with Jessica had awakened something in me, a sense of purpose that went beyond my own comfort and security. I think I'm going to keep helping other grandmas and grandpas who might have people trying to trick them, I told the boys. Just like I helped our family when Jessica was trying to cause trouble, there are other people out there who need someone to look out for them, and I've learned that I'm pretty good at figuring out when someone is not telling the truth. Mason nodded seriously and announced that he wanted to help protect grandmas and grandpas too when he grew up. Lucas added that they could be a team of truth detectors, using research skills and careful observation to catch bad people who tried to hurt elderly families. Their enthusiasm reminded me that the lessons from our experience with Jessica would continue to ripple outward, teaching the next generation to be vigilant and protective of those who might be vulnerable. David smiled as he listened to his sons plan their future careers in elder protection. You know, Mom, I think Jessica's biggest mistake was assuming that being older meant being weaker. She never understood that you had decades of experience that she couldn't match, knowledge that she couldn't access, and patience that she couldn't outlast. She thought age was a disadvantage when it was actually your greatest asset. As we finished our breakfast and began planning the day's activities, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or punishment. Jessica would face the consequences of her actions through the legal system, but more importantly, our community was now stronger and more protected because of what we had learned from her attempts to exploit us. Other elderly people would be safer because of the systems we had put in place and the awareness we had raised. The house that Jessica had once tried to pressure me into selling was still mine, filled with the sounds of my grandson's laughter and the comfortable rhythms of a life lived on my own terms. The independence that she had tried to undermine was stronger than ever, supported by a network of allies and resources that I had built through careful planning and strategic action. The fragility that she had tried to convince everyone was my defining characteristic had been revealed as a facade that concealed strength, determination, and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent learning how to find truth in a world full of deception. Jessica had called me too fragile for housework, but she had never imagined that I might be strong enough to completely dismantle her life with nothing more than research skills, patience, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from knowing you're fighting for more than just yourself. Sometimes the most effective revolutions are the ones that happen in silence, carried out by people who appear harmless until the moment they choose to reveal exactly how dangerous underestimation can be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.